would like to welcome you all today to hear Emily Pastor for her book, The Joys of Jewish Preserving, Modern Recipes with Traditional Roots, for jams, pickles, fruit butters, and more, for holidays and every day. Throughout Jewish history, preserved foods have served both practical and spiritual needs, keeping alive a people and their faith through sojourns in deserts and isolation in ghettos. In her second book, Pastor presents 75 recipes, both traditional and new. These cover jams, fruit preserves, pickles, and even holiday dishes. Emily is a DC native, now based in Chicago, where she writes for the West of the Loop blog. Please join me in welcoming her to Politics and Prose.
Hey, everybody. Thank you, Liz, so much for that introduction. Needless to say, it is an honor to be here tonight. Not only is Politics and Prose, one of the great independent bookstores in America, it is also my bookstore. I grew up right around the corner, off of Fessenden Street, and which have been shopping in this store since it opened. So it is really a dream for me to be here today. Can you guys hear me? Okay, good. I want to thank everyone for coming. If you don't know me and you're here tonight, I want to thank you especially because it's a little bit of Old Home Week. I want to thank all my friends and family who are here too, of course. It's also very special for me to be here at Politics and Prose for this book because this book is an absolutely personal project of mine. It was a real passion project. And I like to say it was the marriage of my two culinary loves, the Jewish food I grew up eating and home food preservation, which is something I began about 10 years ago now. Making my own jams and jellies and pickles and those things inspired by the fruits that and vegetables I was seeing at the farmers market. We have wonderful farmers markets in Chicago. We have wonderful fruit orchards in Michigan and all that. And also in part by my daughter's food allergies, which she had many of as a young child. Thankfully, she's outgrown a bunch of them, but it did inspire me to start making a lot more of our foods from scratch, and also inspired me to turn to making jam because it was something she and I could do in the kitchen together without worrying about any of her allergies. So this book, a lot of people sort of say to me, where did you get the idea for a book about Jewish preserving? And it is the first of its kind to be dedicated exclusively to preserving in the Jewish tradition. A lot of Jewish cookbooks will have, a recipe here and there for a pickle or maybe a compote or something, but it's the first book that's really just done a deep dive on the subject of preserving in the Jewish culinary tradition. And I want to definitely point out that it is both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic traditions. I don't need to say this to a DC audience typically, but in other parts of the country, I need to then stop and explain about Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews. Probably everyone knows, but just in case, the Jewish people are divided into two very distinct cultures. The Ashkenazi Jews are the Jews who had lived in Central Europe, also going northern and Central Europe, Poland, Russia, Ukraine. Those kinds of places. And that's where most American Jews are of Ashkenazi descent. My family certainly is. But there's also the Sephardic culture. Those were the Jews. They originally had settled in Spain, actually. And then they were expelled from Spain during the Inquisition. Ferdinand and Isabella did not just only send Christopher Columbus to these shores. They also expelled all the Jews. And they then settled all around the Mediterranean basin in North Africa and the Middle East. And that they are known as the Sephardic Jews. And as you might imagine from these two such distinct places, they have distinct traditions and very distinct culinary traditions in particular. In part just based on what they were, what kind of ingredients they had to work with, and also in part the Ashkenazi Jews were living in mostly Christian cultures, and the Sephardic Jews were often living in Muslim cultures, where they in fact were more integrated into the society typically. So, that was a little bit of a digression. So how did I get the idea for this book about Jewish preserving? And the truth is, it came to me in response to a very important question from my literary agent. And that question was, well, what other ideas do you have for a book? At the time, I was working on the proposal for my first book, Food Swap. And this was the first time that my agent and I had met face to face. She had only recently agreed to represent me. And so that question of, well, what other ideas do you have sort of struck fear into my heart. I thought I was pretty cool to have come up with one idea. But I certainly wasn't going to say that. So it was one of those situations where literally the thought was forming in my brain and the words were coming out at the same time. So I said, well, I do have this one idea. It's a book about Jewish preserving, again, direct brain to mouth pipeline. And she said, oh, well, tell me more about that. And I said, well, so many of it's very quick, the brain to mouth pipeline. I said, so many of the iconic Jewish foods that we love are either preserves themselves or incorporate some kind of preserved element. So not only do you have your kosher dill pickle or maybe your sauerkraut on your Reuben sandwich, but also think about the applesauce you put on your latkes or the jam that's in our rugelach. These are all either preserves themselves or they have some sort of preserved element. And my agent said, well, I need to know more, but that's a really good idea. And I said, yeah, I know. But I was so excited by this idea that I actually immediately got to work on it. And what I was very happy to discover as I started to do my research is that there was way, way more than just the 4 foods that I had thought of at the top of my head, the 4 Jewish foods that have preserves. And as I did get very into the research, and there's a lot of research in this book because I'm a good graduate of Sidwell Friends School, so I know how to do my research. What I learned was that there was a very robust, and I argue distinctive tradition of Jewish preserving, again, on both the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic side, and that this tradition had not fully been explored before. And so I was really, really excited to get beyond just those first few foods that we might think of, that kosher dill pickle or that sauerkraut, and really explore all of the facets of the Jewish preserving tradition. The argument that I make in the book, and people say to me, well, and this is maybe a question some of you are thinking of, there was certainly a time up until very recently where preserving food was a matter of survival for all people, were they Jewish or Christian or Muslim or anyone. Before a time of refrigeration or cargo transport, everyone was preserving foods because they had to, particularly in harsher climates. And that's certainly true. And so at the same time that Jews in Poland and Russia were preserving foods, their Christian neighbors were preserving foods, and the Sephardic Jews in North Africa, their Muslim neighbors were preserving food. No doubt about it. But the argument I make in the book is that I think there is a distinctive tradition of Jewish preserving, and it stems primarily from the kosher laws. And maybe not in a way that we would think of. But the first sort of interesting point I came across in my research was that because of the kosher laws, which prohibit the mixing of meat and milk, not only in the same dish, like no cheeseburgers, but in the same meal, so that you couldn't have had a meat for your main course and then have a dessert that incorporated dairy in any way, be it cream or butter, that there's always been a very heavy emphasis in Jewish cuisine on fruit as a way to end the meal. Fruit, maybe nuts. Because again, there was no dairy that had to necessarily be involved. And this was true of even festive meals, holiday meals. And of course, particularly in some of the harsher climates where the Ashkenazi Jews were living, there was abundant fruit in the summertime, but once it got to be, I don't know, I've never been to Russia, October, November, certainly you would start to not have any of those fresh fruits available. So what became important in the cuisine was, again, this tradition of preserving the fruits, whether they were going to be dried, to be cooked later into a compote, or whether they were going to be cooked down into a fruit paste or a fruit butter. This was very important so that throughout the rest of the year, you would have something sweet and some way to end your meal. The second point, or the second sort of distinctive element that I came across in my research, again, had to do with the kosher laws, which is that even at a point when the population begins to become more urban in the 19th century and fewer people are making their own foods, again, particularly in the cities, they were starting to go and, you would go and buy your foods. Jewish families who were keeping kosher could not have done so because the food that would have been available in stores, commercially prepared food, would not have been certified kosher. I guess certified maybe isn't the right word, but they had no reassurance, certainly, that that food was kosher. And so what I found was that this sort of DIY tradition of making your own preserves persisted longer in these Jewish communities, again, because of the kosher laws. So that combination of that emphasis on the fruit and also that need to sort of make their own led to again, a distinctive tradition of Jewish preserving that I found in my research. And I keep saying research, and I want to definitely point out that there's a lot of history and a lot of interesting facts and stories in the book, but it is not a history book. It's not food anthropology. It is definitely a cookbook. The recipes are definitely designed to be made. And the goal in the book was to take some of these traditions and some of the interesting, perhaps a holiday tradition, perhaps a flavor combination that I found in my research and update it for how we want to cook and eat today. So I'm going to give one example of that in particular that I think really exemplifies what I was trying to do with the book. And also I get to relay one of my favorite stories from the book. So as I was doing my research, I came across some evidence that there was a tradition in Russia, and this tradition actually persists in some very traditional communities today, maybe in Hasidic communities, of after the festival of Sukkot, which is a fall festival. It's a harvest festival. Some people call it Jewish Thanksgiving. One of the most important parts of the festival of Sukkot is you have to get a citrus fruit that we in English would call a citron, but in Hebrew it's known as an etrog, and you have to wave it around. That's a big part of Sukkot. And again, think about for people in, centuries ago or even up into the 19th century, if you're living in Poland or Russia or Ukraine or Lithuania, getting your hands in October on a citron, on was not any small deal. And in fact, what did happen as Jews began pushing north and north and north and further away from areas where they could easily find a citron, they became importers of citrus. And there's a real connection between Jews and the citrus trade. Because if okay, well, come October, we're going to have to get our hands on an etrog, you're going to find a way to do it. And you're not going to wait till the last minute. We don't do that. So having gone to all this trouble to get your hands on an etrog in Russia in October, you were certainly not going to throw it away when Sukkot ends and you'd waved it around. So what I found was that it was very traditional to make a preserve after Sukkot with your etrog. And these are, if you guys have ever seen one of these things, they're huge. The peel's really thick. There's not a ton of flesh, and they're bitter as heck. So it was an elaborate process. You were boiling the peel 3 times and on and on and on. But it was very important. There was some belief, particularly in Russia, that it eased the pains of childbirth. It was something that was given to expectant mothers. And so there was, so they would make this beautiful kind of preserve called an eingemacht in Yiddish, which really, I think today we would call it a preserve. There would be pieces of peel and pieces of fruit suspended in like a syrup. They would make it with their etrog following Sukkot, and they would open it for the first time on Tu B'Shvat, which is a holiday that tends to fall kind of in the dead of winter, typically. And I was so charmed by this story and learning about this tradition, which again I think still persists in some very traditional communities. And I knew I wanted to incorporate it in the book, but the citrons or the etrogs that we see today, a lot of times they're grown for ceremonial purposes and their looks are very prized. So they're grown with a lot of pesticides. And so I wasn't exactly necessarily wanted to encourage people to make a preserve out of their etrogs. So I adapted the recipe and came up with what I call it in the book, it's a lemon walnut eingemacht. And I recommend that you make a similar type of preserve. It's very similar to a marmalade, but that you go ahead and use those organic lemons, because again, you're using the peel. And it would be even especially fabulous with Meyer lemons, which we get in this winter, and it's so fun when they come in January and February, and everything else in the supermarket looks so sad. But there's all this beautiful citrus. So that was an example of a very traditional idea and concept that I took and adapted to try to be more in keeping with how we like to cook and eat today. That's one of my favorite stories from the book about the lemon. And it's a beautiful preserve too. It's, because it's yellow and it's really gorgeous. I do want to say I'm going to open up to questions really soon. But I do want to say that if canning is not your thing, that's totally fine. Any of the recipes in the book can absolutely be made as a refrigerator jam or a refrigerator pickle. The idea was certainly that I was hoping that canners and the folks out there who are into canning and preserving, they're always looking for new recipes and new flavor combinations. So I was really hoping that passionate preservers who might not be Jewish would be interested in the book and interested in hearing some of these new flavor ideas, but also that people who are interested in Jewish cuisine who maybe haven't preserved before, aren't necessarily already into preserving, that they might be inspired to either start preserving, because it's not as hard as it seems, and I do explain in the book how to go through it and do it safely. But also, again, any of the recipes could be made as a refrigerator jam or as a refrigerator pickle. They don't make huge quantities. You won't be stuck with 7 jars of jam that you have to keep in your fridge. So it really is, I hope, a book for everybody. And then, as the presence of the babka indicates, there are some recipes in the book that I like to call use your preserves. So there's a challah recipe, and there's a rugelach recipe, there's a latke recipe, all the things that you need to have to either put your preserves on or to incorporate your preserves. I feel like there's always a lot of questions when I do events, so I'm going to maybe open it up to questions. Is that okay, Liz?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So please step up to the mic because we are recording the event.
Oh, if only I'd known we were recording the event. It looks like we have a question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your words. I'm greatly enjoying reading the book.
Thank you.
You're welcome. One of the favorite things, for me, one of the most meaningful things that I have read so far is learning about your relationship with the Mohr family in France. And my question is, is there any particular recipe, or are there any particular recipes specifically that the Mohrs inspired or helped to inspire?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. That's such a great question. So one of the things I talk about in the book is I mentioned that my family is Ashkenazi, as are most American Jews, but I actually got the experience of getting to live with a Sephardic family when I was a student in France. I lived with a Sephardic family who were actually Jews who had been in Algeria and had been there for centuries. There were many, many Sephardic Jews in North Africa that had gone back generations. And, of course, when Algeria becomes independent in the 50s, all the French people that were there, many of whom had probably never set foot in France, were kicked out and went back to France, again, probably somewhere they'd never been, including this family. They are known in French as pieds noirs, and including this family that I was lucky enough to live with for a year when I was a student in Paris, the Mohr family. So that was my first exposure to Sephardic Jewry, was that experience of living with them. And it was a wonderful, wonderful experience because I learned so much and ate all their really fabulous food. I call her my French mother, Anise Mohr, and she was a wonderful cook. I would say the main recipe that's in a lot of the Sephardic recipes remind me of things, but there's a recipe in the book for a Moroccan spread called matboukhah. I got to get matboucha. And that was absolutely very similar to something that my French Anise Mohr would make. It's a salad. You can make it as a salad with tomatoes and peppers. I kind of make it as a spread or a dip and make it safe for canning. And one of the things that's really fun about it, too, is that you can then use the matboucha as a basis for shakshuka. Which is, for some of you guys who don't know, is a dish where you poach eggs in like a spicy tomato sauce. So thank you so much for that question. Yeah. Oh, there's a mic over there.
Staying with that topic.
Yeah.
I live in Paris, and I share the Jewish holidays with a Sephardic woman. She cooks Sephardic, I cook Ashkenazi.
That's so
My
great.
mother taught me, and all she knew about spices was chicken schmaltz. But Sephardic food is much better.
Yeah, it kind of is, isn't it?
And it's filled with vegetables and fruits and all that sort of thing. In your research, did you find a significant difference between preservation of foods in Ashkenazi tradition and Sephardic tradition?
That's such a great question. Sit down, you guys, because we're going to be here a while. That's such a great question. Absolutely. There was a huge difference in the preservation traditions among the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic Jews. And I think initially going in, I thought, well, preservation is going to have been so much more important for the Ashkenazi Jews because they lived in this harsh climate with this short growing season. But in fact, preserving fruits and vegetables was very, very important to the Sephardic cuisine as well. There was I'm going to take a step back. First of all, the biggest difference is sugar, is the sweetener used. So for Ashkenazi Jews, until well into the 19th century, sugar is a luxury ingredient. Until you start getting sugar beet processing plants in Poland. I told you guys I did a lot of research. But honey is the main sweetener, and sugar is a luxury ingredient. So a lot of the really traditional Ashkenazi preserves either use honey or are low sugar preserves. That's where you get all these fruit butters and fruit pastes, things like prune lekvar, because those are lower sugar preserves. The Sephardic Jews, on the other hand, there's plentiful sugar throughout the Arab world. The Arabs spread the sugar throughout the world starting in like the Middle Ages, so they have just tons of sugar. So what I found is that there's a very robust tradition of candying fruits almost and making these very sweet preserves in the Sephardic world, including things like sometimes they're known as spoon sweets. And if you can imagine like a perfect, beautiful half of an apricot, in a heavy sugar syrup. This was a very traditional apricots. They would do it with figs. Quince is a very important Sephardic ingredient. These are very traditional Sephardic preserves. And again, and one of the things I came across in my research is, hospitality is such an important value for that part of the world, for the Arab world in the Middle East. And one of the things I came across in my research was that it was very traditional to greet guests. You wanted to greet guests with something sweet. And so it would be very traditional to greet a guest with one of these beautiful spoon sweets, or dulces, they're also known as. Because remember, the Sephardic Jews coming from Spain, their language wasn't Yiddish, it was a language called Ladino, which is Spanish-based. So they would call these sweets dulces. And so you would greet a guest with one of these. And in fact, it became this elaborate ceremony. You would use silver trays and crystal bowls, and these things would have been part of a bride's dowry, these items. So I did find that, in part because of this tradition, very robust and very rich preserving tradition in the Sephardic world. And then also, last thing I'm going to say about that is, if you think about when you go to the Middle Eastern restaurant, there's those meze, those little salads that are often served in the beginning. A lot of those are pickled vegetables. So again, the pickling is also important for people in this part of the world. So lucky you. When are we all going to Paris?
Thank you. This is a beautiful book. And
Thank
as I
you.
was looking through it, I noticed you don't have pectin in any of your preserves. Could you talk about it?
So that's a canner right there, everybody. So pectin is a great question. So pectin is, for those of you who aren't regular canners, pectin is a substance that gives fruit structure. Some fruits are high in pectin, some fruits are low in pectin. The example I like to give to people when they're trying to think about this is the backpack test. If you would be comfortable putting a piece of fruit in your backpack and walking around all day and eating it later, like what would that be? Like an apple, an orange, right? Those fruits are high in pectin. Fruit that you wouldn't like to do that with, an apricot, those are low in pectin. The bounce test works too, because blueberries are higher in pectin than raspberries, and blueberries you drop in might bounce. So pectin is used. So pectin is one of the things that is really important when making jam. At the end of the day, you want to have jam, right? You want to have something that you can spread, something that's gelled, and so you do need the interaction of the fruits, pectin, and acid and sugar to get you that texture. One of the things that we do a lot in canning today is you can add pectin to your preserves. You can buy powdered pectin or liquid pectin, and it's not evil or bad. Some canners are really opposed to it. No added pectin. It's not poison. It's like pectin. It's totally naturally occurring. And what it does is, by adding it to our preserves, it allows us to cook them for a shorter time and get a bit more of a fruit-forward flavor. And sometimes you can use less sugar too, right? When you're doing. So when I started to write this book, I had a lot of decisions to make. One of them was I going to include like pickled meat and pickled fish and stuff? And the answer is obviously no. But the other was what was I going to do about adding pectin? And of course, if traditionally, the idea of adding pectin, commercial pectin that you would go out and buy would not have been traditional. So I decided I was going to do all the recipes without pectin. It's easier to do with smaller batches, because, and so I should say that if you don't add pectin to your preserves, what you have to do is you have to cook them to a higher temperature, to 220 degrees, which is the sort of magic gelling point. Hard to do with big batches. Easier to do in smaller batches. So I kind of made a decision that I was going to do a smaller batches and not include pectin in any of the preserves. What it does mean is a lot of the jams are what I call softer set jams, particularly some of the like the apricot jam that you guys tried today. That's a runny jam, right? I don't, it doesn't bother me, but if you're looking for a really firm jam, it's not gonna have the same set as like a Smucker's. Did that answer your question? Okay, good. Yeah.
I was just looking at your book. It looks really good.
Thank you.
And my question is, do you plan to do a follow-up book on the pickled meat and fish? Because I would love to see herring, especially.
Oh, yeah. So I have good news for you. My friend Karen Solomon, who's a Bay Area-based food writer, is working on a book right now on pickled fish and all that stuff with Story Publishing. And I feel honestly super relieved. I'm like, thank God Karen did it and I don't have to.
Jewish emphasis as well?
I think it's going to be really all-encompassing. So because cured fish is one of those things, like it's Swedish and it's Russian and it's Jewish, and so I think she's Jewish herself, and she gave me a lovely endorsement on this book, but I think she's gonna go kind of all over with it. But yeah, so look for Karen's book. I've been talking about everyone. I get that question a lot and I'm always like, wait for Karen's book. Yeah. Any more? Yeah, come on up.
Have you ever done anything with scavenging fruit, like in urban areas? Going, the park has a crab apple tree that nobody ever picks, and so go and collect it, or then make jams like that.
Yeah, so I think we call it foraging now, right? Because that sounds
right.
better.
Yeah,
It's all about market. No,
Yeah, right.
Scavenging somehow sounds bad.
Yeah,
we call it foraging.
Right, exactly.
So, so there's a recipe in the book for mulberry jam. Okay, and which goes right to this point.
It's true because
So-
it's all over. Yeah.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I grew up here in DC, and we used to go to Palisades Pool Club, which is, remember, I don't know how to describe where it is, Mom. It's on Seven Locks Road. And there was these mulberry trees, right? And they would drop the fruit and they would get over everybody's cars. And all the people hated the mulberry trees, right? And so I just thought of mulberries as like this giant nuisance. And in fact, mulberries are beloved in the Middle East and in
Really?
places like Turkey. Absolutely beloved.
They are delicious.
And they're
so
they're
good
like a
for you.
superfood. Yeah, they're a
Yeah.
complete superfood. So again, doing my research, and I was like, well, I have to include a mulberry jam recipe because again, it's
Great.
really part of the Sephardic tradition. And yeah, I went,
Is it in here?
it is absolutely in there.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
That's
so
really good.
so that, and I did go to like a park in my neighborhood, and I was like,
Yeah.
you
know.
put down a sheet, you shake the tree, and and you make your children pick up the mulberries, and you make mulberry jam. But I also knew that most people in America think of mulberries as trash and a nuisance. So I also, right on the other facing the page for the mulberry jam is the recipe for I call it Faux Mulberry Jam, and it's blueberries and blackberries mixed together to mimic the taste of mulberries.
Oh, yeah,
because
yeah,
I do
those
think
are
people have a prejudice
Good
against
flavors.
them.
Service berries are good for that too. Service berries, they're all over the place too. You can mix those into. But
Yeah.
sometimes I worry about the air
Being
quality,
sprayed.
the pollution and the spraying, and whether it's organic, because I'm a nurse and I like organic food also. I was glad you said that about the lemons. But that's the thing I worry about, exhaust of the cars sometimes.
Yeah, me
I
too.
try not to get it too close to the road or anything.
Exactly. My kids go to a Jewish overnight camp in Wisconsin, and there are mulberry trees all over the camp. And I found out that my son, who's the pickiest eater in the world, back me up, Mom. Yeah. My 4 relatives in front are like, yeah, that kid really is the pickiest eater in the world. He was like, oh, we're all eating these mulberries at camp. And I was like, and I looked at my husband, I'm like, next year, bring in a basket.
Have you ever seen the dogwood, by the way, the fruit of dogwood? Or I made some jam with that and something else too. They're ripe now. They're little pink
Yeah, I don't know.
balls.
I just, you just want to make sure that you sound like you really know what you're doing.
I
You
don't.
want to make,
I really don't.
well,
That's
see,
why I was asking.
yeah, you got to make sure people know what they're doing before they go out and start harvesting stuff. The only other thing that's sort of foraged in the book is the recipe for the fermented, I have a recipe for vinegar dill pickles, but I also have a recipe for really traditional fermented kosher dill pickles. And people always ask me what the secret is to having crunchy pickles, not mushy pickles. And the answer is you need something with tannins to stick in your fermenting crock. And grape leaves have tannins, or red currant leaves have tannins, but also oak leaves have tannins. So that's another thing is I do. I go out in my neighborhood and I try to find a nice oak tree, and I pick some leaves and I wash them real good because I do worry about that. And then I stick them in my fermented pickles.
But grape leaves will do
Grape
that?
leaves will do it.
Oh,
Yep,
that's really
absolutely.
good. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you.
Hey.
I have 2 questions.
Okay.
I'll ask them and then you can answer them. One is, what did your publisher say or editor say to you? What's your next? What other ideas do you have?
My agent.
So your agent. So do we know
Yeah.
what might be next? And the other question is, was there anything that you were working on, a recipe you were figuring out, and it was so awful or so difficult or undoable, it is not in this book?
Why do people always ask that? But yes. I do have another idea. I'm kind of not at the place where I can talk about it yet. So, but thank you for asking. I have another idea too, which just occurred to me, which is I want to write a book about where all the recipes are savory, but they have fruit. Don't you think that's a good idea, food people? Savory fruit. Okay, coming soon. Savory fruit. That just came to my head. But so the question about like, is there anything that didn't make it in the book or almost? So I really wanted, so black radishes. I don't know if you guys have seen them at the farmer's market. Black radishes, they're amazing. Sometimes they're called Spanish radishes. They are coal black on the outside, and then you cut into them and they're white. They're so cool. And it's something that was very traditional in Ashkenazi food, is like a black radish, like a salad, grated black radish. Again, they were in like Poland and Russia. They didn't have a lot to go on. So black radish, very traditional for Ashkenazi food. So I knew I wanted to have something with black radishes. And I originally was going to do a fermented black radish pickle. It smelled so bad. My family was like, we're going to a hotel. The whole house smells like feet. This is disgusting. And I chucked it. And there is a recipe in the book for a quick pickled black radish where you just slice it up and you put it in some vinegar and you pop it in the fridge. And they're pretty tasty actually, but yeah, the fermented one was really a no-go. The other thing that's funny is I did come across in my research, again, the Ashkenazi Jews, it was rough, like you're in Poland, you're in Russia, you're in Belarus. And one of the things I came across was that they were making jam, these eingemacht, these particular type of preserves, they were making them with beets. They were making them with radishes. They were making them with carrots. Like, come winter, they just didn't have much. And so anything that was at all naturally sweet, they would make jam out of. And I just thought, oh, God, that sounds so gross. But in fact, there is a recipe in the book for a beet jam, because what I found was that there's a thing there that beet marmalade has become kind of like a trendy thing. Like people serve it with cheese or whatnot. So I thought, okay, well, beet jam, beet marmalade, it's not that far off. So it's different. It's for sure a little different. But it would be a cool thing to serve maybe like on the cheese plate. Beet jam. Anyone else? Okay, well, I think if there's no other questions, we will end here, and I will be happy to sign any books. So thank you all so much.